Check.
Got it? Does the screen say we're good? Is it?
Action.
Okay. And I think it's set up so none of you guys are on. It's just me. So, okay. Camera loves this. What? Oh, absolutely. Yep. Oh, I got your. Did you? They were just the terms, right? Okay. All right. So look, here's the plan. We basically have today, Wednesday, and Thursday. I'm out Friday. I was supposed to be out today, but I got out of the professional development. I'm pretty sure I can finish all the stuff on World War I, the Great War, before the end of class on Thursday. Friday, in my absence, I'll leave the video on the presidents. I'll have you guys watch, we'll probably go McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and then jump ahead to Wilson. So that'll take us through the Spanish-American War, American imperialism during the Roosevelt presidency, the big stick policy, and then the Wilson stuff will have a lot in that segment about the Versailles Treaty and the Great War and the war to end all wars. And then when we come back on Monday, we'll do practice questions, sample questions, and I'll try to mix it up so there's some regents and some college. And then let's plan on Tuesday of next week, we'll have this unit test. Does that work? Any issues with that? Any conflicts? Anything you know of ahead of time? Because I'll move stuff around if need be. All right. We are a little bit off the pace of where I've been in previous years. I think mainly because we had so many snow days, and I missed those 2 days to go to Chicago for that funeral, and I'm out Friday. But it's not an issue. It's just I want to make sure that I don't drag my feet on this part. So, any questions before we dive right in? Okay, so the Great War, World War I, begins in Europe in 1914. It's basically, well, it's the Allies, England, France, pre-revolutionary Russia, Tsarist Russia, the Allies, versus the Central Powers, primarily Germany, but also Austria-Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and what we used to call the Ottoman Empire. The war, I don't want to oversimplify or reduce it too much, but the heavyweights in this, the two main belligerents were who? Yeah, England and Germany. So England had kind of been the superior power in Europe until Germany was formed in the 1870s under Bismarck, Prussian militarism, blood and iron. So as you get to the early 1900s, that delicate balance of power that had existed was disrupted. And England and Germany, were both competing for empire. And if you remember, England, what was England's primary strength? Their navy. They, Britannia, ruled Britannia. They ruled the waves. Their navy was unmatched, unrivaled. Okay, so when World War I started, from the German perspective, you had a two-front war. So, I don't have a great Europe map here, but the war bogged down pretty early into horrific trench warfare. Do you remember this from global studies somewhat? So, here's Germany primarily fighting a two-front war. England and France in the west, Russia in the east. England used its navy and its naval advantage to blockade or cut off continental Europe. The strategy being to starve out Germany and hasten their surrender, right? Well, Germany couldn't match England's navy. But what did they have? U-boats, undersea boats, submarines. And they used them to torpedo British ships. Initially, naval vessels, but as the war dragged on, like passenger liners, right? So, here's the situation like in 1914, 15, and 16 before we get involved in the war. There's this horrible global conflict between the Allies and the Central Powers. It's basically become just horrific trench warfare, and on the high seas, it's the British Navy versus Germany's submarines. All right, we're neutral, sort of. If you go to the top of page 10, reasons for U.S. entry in 1917, despite initial neutrality. We're going to look at 4 things here that basically drew us into the war on the side of the Allies. Even though Woodrow Wilson, when he ran for re-election successfully in 1916, his campaign pledge was, "I kept us out of war." Right? His supporters basically used this as the pitch for his re-election. He kept us out of war. There's this horrible war waging in Europe, but we're going to stay neutral. Well, that didn't last very long. He gets re-elected in 1916. He gets inaugurated in 1917. Well, that's the same year that we ultimately get dragged into the war. All right? So I'm just trying to set the stage with the Great War as we segue here into the reasons why we got drawn in. Any questions? Start with number 1. Cultural and economic ties with the Allies. Who were the Allies in World War I? England, France, and Russia, primarily. There's a few others. But the United States, had much more in common culturally, linguistically, economically, historically, with the democratic Allies. So England, basically a limited monarchy with a parliament and a prime minister. England, same language. England, sure, we achieved our independence from them, but that was a long time ago. France, our first ally, right? We don't win the Revolutionary War without France's navy. Culturally, politically, much more in common with democratic England and democratic France than authoritarian Kaiser-led Germany. Germany, this is before Hitler, this is before the Axis powers, this isn't like Nazi fascism, but Germany during World War I was more of an old world pseudo-monarchy, the Kaiser, not really democratic. By contrast, England and France, democracies. Okay? So culturally, most Americans during World War I sympathized with the Allies. The vast majority of Americans, if they were choosing sides in this war, lined up alongside England and France. Okay, they didn't have much in common with Russia, but England and France, I think for the most part, were the countries that most Americans wanted to see emerge victorious. Now, Wilson said, "I kept us out of war." Wilson said, we're going to stay neutral. But I think even Wilson, in his heart of hearts, was rooting for England in World War I, was rooting for France in World War I. Maybe it's more accurate to say he was rooting against autocratic, authoritarian, Kaiser-led, not democratic, more totalitarian Germany. Okay? So if you had taken a poll of Americans during the early years of the First World War, you would have seen more support for the Allies. What might the exceptions have been? What segment of America's population would have been rooting for Germany and the Central Powers? Okay, yeah, German Americans, obviously, right? And there were a lot of them. Germany and German immigrants were part of that new wave of immigration, like in the 1870s, 80s, up until the 20s. So I think it's safe to say that German Americans were rooting for their homeland, right? What other group of Americans? Now, Italy before the war was one of the Central Powers, but almost immediately they switched sides. Yeah. Once the dust settles, Italy is definitely positioned alongside the Allies. But you're on the right track. Think about this. It's not so much what group in America in 1914, 15, and 16 would have been rooting for Germany. It's what group in America during the run-up to our involvement in World War I would have been rooting against England. Exactly. The Irish. Irish Americans despised England. right? Irish Catholics always had, you know, a pretty intense rivalry, hostility towards the occupying, invading force of the British. So spot on, bullseye, absolutely. So German Americans and Irish Americans were not pro-Allies, but they made up a relatively small segment of our population. The vast majority of Americans sympathized with the Allies, okay? And it's not just cultural. Here we go again. It's economic. It's economic. American banks, American businesses had loaned money to both sides in World War I. But the vast majority of it went to England and France. If England and France, if they lose World War I, if they lose the Great War, it's entirely possible that these loans don't get repaid. Did some American banks make loans to Germany and Central Powers? Yes, but much smaller scale. It's interesting. Are you guys at all familiar with downtown Buffalo? Do you ever watch like Channel 2 News where they're on the roof doing the weather and you can see what's called the Liberty Building with the two mini statues of Liberty on the top of it in downtown Buffalo? Have you ever seen that building? Okay, that building has been called the Liberty Bank building since World War I. You know what it was called before World War I? The German Bank. The German Bank. That's what it was called. Grant, just remind me at the end to update your attendance. All right? So, two things I think are significant about that. There was a bank in Buffalo called the German Bank that had to change its name during World War I because of anti-German hostility. More on that in a second. And you would assume that the German bank probably was willing to make loans to Germany. But, sorry, overwhelmingly, American banks and businesses had a stake in making sure the Allies won. Okay? Questions on that? A lot of money invested in the Allied nations. England was a major trading partner. France was a major trading partner. Germany, not as much, for sure. Okay. And if you look at some of the online reading stuff, I know some people do it, some people don't. In the online reading assignment that goes with this particular part of the unit, they point out that we made $2 billion in loans to the Allies. That's a lot. That's a lot in 1917 currency rates. So that's number one. We had cultural and economic ties with the Allies. If we were ever going to get involved, it was pretty unlikely that we would fight alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. Our primary loyalty, not loyalty, but like pre-war allegiance or rooting interest, I guess is the term I'm looking for, was always with the Allies. Clear enough? Okay. Number two, Allied propaganda. When the war in Europe gets bogged down into trench warfare and massive casualties and really not much progress either way, England and France sought to exploit American preference for their victory. Basically, England and France did everything they could, in the 3 years prior to our involvement in World War I, to represent, to portray, or let's say depict the Central Powers as a ruthless, aggressive war machine. What's propaganda? How do you define that? What's the definition of propaganda? So if you're trying to persuade somebody, politically, or if you're trying to appeal to them so that they'll buy something, right, commercials or propaganda, your goal is to sway them. Your goal is to persuade them. And, you might sensationalize, you mentioned sensationalizing yellow journalism. You're certainly not going to look in a balanced way at both sides. And the British, and to a lesser extent the French, just inundated us with a steady stream of anti-German propaganda. All right? The Allies depicted the Germans as a barbaric, uncivilized, ruthless, evil, tyrannical war machine. Were they? Well, maybe. You know, were there any examples of ruthlessness or aggression or hostility or brutality on the part of the British or the French in World War I? Sure, sure. But the Allies wanted us to believe that the Germans were the ones who were overwhelmingly responsible for starting the war and waging it in a brutal manner. Okay. So, there were films, there were movies that were put out during the early years of World War I, like The Beast of Berlin, and a movie called The Hun, H-U-N. What name usually goes before the Hun? Attila the Hun, right? You know, he's like this marauding warrior. Okay, well, the Germans were represented in that unfavorable light by most of the Allies. Okay, so that's Allied propaganda. The British would frequently talk about how, oh, in order for the Germans to get at France, they had to go through neutral, do you remember what country from Global? Belgium, like neutral Belgium. They called it the rape of Belgium. All right. Now that's true, that happened. And I don't know that it's 50-50 in terms of, you know, culpability or responsibility for the war. But, you know, there are atrocities on both sides. All right. But it didn't matter. Allied propaganda was effective. And most Americans, again, did side with the Allies. Most Americans, even before the war, sided with the Allies. And this idea that we were somehow neutral is pretty far-fetched. If we objected to German U-boats torpedoing British ships, as we should have. But we could have also, and probably should have also, objected to England's blockade of Germany if we were going to be truly neutral. If we were truly neutral, you know, we would have traded either with both sides or neither, right? Are you neutral if you're selling weapons to nations at war? If God forbid some terrorist organization detonates a suitcase nuke in Times Square, if that nuke is demonstrated to have come from, I don't know, Pakistan or Russia, you think the United States, regardless of who our president was, would hold that country responsible? God, yes. So neutrality in war would mean either trading with no one or equally with both sides. That never happened. And the Allied propaganda that we were just, you know, inundated with had an effect. The German bank building in Buffalo was changed to the Liberty Bank building. We got all hung up. There was a wave of anti-German hysteria in America as we became more and more involved and ultimately drawn into World War I. What's going to happen as soon as the war is over in terms of the legal manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol in this country? What's going to happen to availability of booze in America at the end of World War I? It's gone. By virtue of Prohibition. 18th Amendment. Wait a minute. Go ahead. Well, hold that thought when we get to the 20s. We'll dissect that. But, well, before World War I, look, what's the amendment that bans alcohol in America? It's the 18th, Prohibition Amendment. When's it get ratified? It goes into effect in 1919, 1920, but the process of getting that amendment passed is in the final years of our involvement in World War I. There's a connection here. Get this, watch this, this is key. How do you ratify an amendment to the Constitution? What's it take? You need a supermajority. It's really hard to get. Do you remember the number? So you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Good luck. That's tough to get. Then you need 3/4 of the states. It's tough to get an amendment. It's supposed to be tough to get an amendment. It's supposed to require a supermajority. Okay, have you ever wondered this? If 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states wanted to ban all booze, there must have been pretty popular support for that. But then as soon as that amendment went into effect and Prohibition went into effect, you had, like, sure, you had widespread violation of that law, and eventually that's the only amendment that we ever what? Repealed with another amendment. Well, then how the heck did it get passed? Because there was an anti-German component to Prohibition. A big reason why Prohibition passed was as World War I was winding down, a lot of Americans felt like, how can we justify taking grains and distilling them into booze when we've got soldiers and like starving refugees to feed? And, gee, how much do we despise, resent the Germans who we've become convinced are responsible for starting this war? Well, what do the Germans like to do? Drink beer. So we'll show them, we'll ban alcohol in America. Okay, stupid idea. More on that when we get to the 20s. But I just want you to have a feel for that connection between anti-German hysteria and the actual passage of Prohibition, which is one of the biggest mistakes in American history. Get it? And there was also like an anti-Catholic component to that. Nativism, xenophobia. Too many Catholics are coming into this country, and their mass includes wine. We'll show them. Whatever. So, but it worked. It worked. Not only was that seen in Prohibition, but Allied propaganda led to like this anti-German hysteria. What German side dish goes well with frankfurters, hot dogs, wieners? Sauerkraut. Guess what sauerkraut was called in America during World War I? We changed the name of it because sauerkraut sounds too damn German. What was the bank build, the German bank building changed to? Liberty Bank. Sauerkraut was changed to Liberty Cabbage. Really? That's what we called it. Talk about a semantic overreaction. It's a word, it's a food. That's how ridiculously, hyper-patriotic we got in the run-up to World War I. That's how insanely anti-German we got. A lot of schools stopped teaching German, and it never really came back. German used to be one of the most popular languages taught in American high schools. Not anymore. It's very rare to find them. No disrespect to my good friend Ellison, and no disrespect to my former student and colleague, Ms. Clausen. I don't know if French and Spanish are the most marketable languages you could learn. In the modern economy, you should probably learn Mandarin Chinese. You should probably learn Japanese. You should probably learn Arabic. You should probably learn German. Germany is like the powerhouse in Europe now economically. Those are the languages we should probably learn. But we have not seen German taught in American schools on a large-scale basis since this event, since World War I. Changing the name of sauerkraut? Liberty Cabbage.
Well, we love that name.
Well, how do you feel about the name Freedom Fries?
I like it.
Anybody know the history behind that? After 9/11, when former President Bush organized a coalition to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, ostensibly for the purpose of democratizing those countries, there were some European countries who didn't go along with it, most notably the French. And there was a big anti-French backlash in America. And, we'll show them, like in the early 2000s, we'll change the name of French fries to Freedom Fries. That was real. And really stupid. I'm a red-blooded American boy. I would have preferred the French to be on board with the coalition of the willing. but I never once referred to French fries as freedom fries except in class. You know what the French did to retaliate? They changed the name of American cheese to idiot cheese. Well played. Well played. So, propaganda often works. Okay? So any questions on numbers 1 or 2? Any thoughts on, like, changing the name of French fries? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should have been more patriotic and called them freedom fries. That was kind of stupid.
I turned eagle screech.
Say again?
I think I turned eagle screech. All legal.
Yeah. That makes you feel patriotic, right?
Okay.
Okay.
That was a joke.
I got you.
Big day.
All right. So those were factors. But look, when we talked about the Spanish-American War, we talked about all the underlying causes, right? How we got involved in the Spanish-American War. But what did it take ultimately to draw us into the Spanish-American War? Sinking of the Maine. Okay. So there's got to be some like major precipitating cause. And if you want to make that parallel with World War I and our involvement in that war, it's probably this one, number 3. Unrestricted German submarine warfare. So let's go back to what we said about the situation in the North Atlantic. England wants to starve out Germany, stop it from being resupplied. So they basically set up a blockade. And I would too, if I was the British. And you know what? If I was the Germans, I would try to knock out that blockade using my submarines. Warning, a state of warfare exists between England and her allies and Germany and its allies, and the North Atlantic should be considered a war zone. That very language was put in the form of an advertisement that the German government published in virtually every major East Coast American newspaper. In other words, American citizens, if you're traveling to Europe on a passenger liner, a French vessel, a British vessel, basically you're fair game. Travel at your own risk. You've been warned. This gets complicated because during the run-up to our involvement in World War I, there were periods when the Germans only targeted British naval vessels, and then there were periods where they said, well, England is using passenger vessels to smuggle supplies to England. So we have to torpedo those too. Let's talk a little bit about the HMS Lusitania, okay? The ill-fated, seemingly in the early 1900s, almost cursed White Star Line. What luxury ocean liner did the White Star Line build in 1912? The Titanic. The Titanic. You know, the most luxurious passenger liner of its time. And it's going to set a speed record in its maiden voyage from England to New York, right? But of course, everyone knows what happened. It struck an iceberg, and it sank. And they didn't have enough lifeboats. And we've all seen the cheesy love story movie. All right. How long did it take the Titanic to sink? 3 hours. 3 hours. There was time to evacuate, they just didn't have enough lifeboats. Okay. Now, the White Star Line builds an even more impressive luxury liner, the Lusitania. It too would sink in the Atlantic, off the coast of Ireland, because it was torpedoed by a German submarine. The Lusitania sank in 20 minutes. The Lusitania, the torpedo hit the Lusitania, and there was an explosion, and then there were a bunch of other explosions. What was on the Lusitania? Munitions, weapons. The Lusitania sank so quickly that it was virtually impossible to evacuate. There were something like 2,000 people on the Lusitania. I think around 700 lived. The majority died. Around 1,200 died, including 126 Americans. So, from the German perspective, passenger liners were considered fair game. And look, I'm actually neutral in this conflict, right? 100 years ago, wasn't around. But the Germans had warned Americans, look, because England basically uses passenger liners and passengers as human shields, you know, we can't guarantee your safe passage. Well, nevertheless, the sinking of the Lusitania outraged Americans and outraged President Wilson. All right, the Lusitania is torpedoed in 1915. We don't get involved until 1917. We basically said to the Germans after the sinking of the Lusitania, this happens again, that's an act of war. And the Germans briefly pledged to not sink passenger liners. But as the war dragged on, Germany just made the calculation that, all right, we have to resume sinking passenger liners. And yes, it'll probably bring America into the war, but hopefully we can defeat England and France on the Western Front by then. And actually, what happened on the Eastern Front in early 1917, Russia basically went through its revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, surrendered, and Germany figured, all right, well, we can throw our forces west. But ultimately, American entry into the war because of unrestricted submarine warfare did win it for the Allies. Okay? So we felt like Germany was not respecting our freedom of the seas. We felt like Germany was not respecting our rights as a neutral nation, but we weren't truly neutral. We believed, Wilson believed, Americans came to believe that we have justification for going to war against Germany because of these dead Americans on British passenger liners. But we also favor England and France because they're democracies. It's like, what did we say about the Spanish-American War? Did we go to war to liberate Cuba? Yeah. Did we go to war to kind of invoke the Monroe Doctrine? Okay. But we really went to war with Spain. Why? Why? Because we knew we'd win and we'd get what? We'd get colonies. We'd get naval bases. That's the real reason. Did we go to war with Germany because of the Lusitania? Yeah. But we also went to war alongside England and France against Germany because we wanted to make the world safe for, what did Wilson say? Democracy. We prefer that the Allies win. They're democratic. And we have more money invested in them. And culturally, we have more in common with them. I'll say it again. We were never truly neutral in the run-up to World War I. Okay? Number 4. The Zimmermann note. The Zimmermann telegram. Not to be confused with the DeLome letter. So Zimmermann was like a German ambassador and like a war minister. And the Germans basically sent a telegram to Mexico, as all this run-up to American involvement in World War I is going on. So remember what we talked about yesterday with Pancho Villa and like Pershing being sent into Mexico to try to find Pancho Villa, never did, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and the tension between Mexico and America at this time. I referenced this a little bit yesterday, but here we'll get into it in more detail. Germany wanted to exploit that tension. Germany knew that America was close to coming into the war on the side of England and France. They didn't want that. So Zimmermann sent a message to Mexico, to the government of Mexico, start a war with the United States. We know what's going on over there. Wilson's trying to find Pancho Villa. There are all these border raids, and there's a lot of tension. So go to war with America. I know you tried that and lost, but just keep them busy. And then when we're done defeating England and France over here, we'll come help you conquer America and regain what? You can get back those areas in the American Southwest that used to be yours. We will help you get back California and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and Utah and Nevada and Colorado and parts of Wyoming. Yep, we'll help you get those back if you wage war against the U.S.
So what was Mexico's capability to wage war against the U.S.?
Minimal. Minimal. Their government couldn't even control the bandits who were raiding American towns.
So was it more of just a distraction?
Yeah. It was basically, look, listen. German military experts, pretty good. And this was like overlap between military strategy and useful diplomacy. I suspect that Germany knew that Mexico probably wouldn't go along with this. But it didn't matter. We got a hold of the Zimmermann note. You know, we basically, through espionage and spying, were made aware of the Zimmermann note. And that was kind of like the last straw. So, you've got cultural and economic ties with the Allies. You've got Allied propaganda depicting Germany as this ruthless war machine. And it's very effective. You've got unrestricted submarine warfare and this idea that Germany was violating our freedom of the seas and our rights as a neutral nation. And then you add on the Zimmermann note, where Germany's actually trying to antagonize our southern neighbor to wage war against us. You know, game changer. Game changer. So, because of all these factors, Wilson became not the first president to go back on a campaign promise. He may have kept us out of war, but by 1917, we declared war on Germany. So turn the page. Mobilizing for war. All right. So with the Congressional Declaration of War against Germany and the Central Powers in 1917, America becomes a nation at war. And Wilson becomes a wartime president. And Holden Caulfield, for all intents and purposes, is kind of like a whiny teenager. Does he like anything, Luke? Or does he just complain about everything? I know he's supposed to be a sympathetic character. I got to be honest with you. When I read Catcher in the Rye, I like the book. He kind of rubs me the wrong way. Okay, we get it, Holden. We get it. All adults are jerks, and you know everything, and blah, blah, blah. Anybody else get that?
No, yeah. I don't know that's true.
How dare you?
There you go. Busy reading.
Throw your fist, punk. Do your worst. It's on tape. Let's go. Go ahead and read. College course. I'm not your mommy. All right. So, Wilson becomes a wartime president. And you don't say as a wartime president, oh, we're going to war against Germany because we have $2 billion in loans extended to the Allies and we need them to win. Nobody says that. Instead, you say, the world must be made safe for democracy. But it's both, right? You don't say, if you're President Wilson asking Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, you don't say, well, you know, England and France culturally just have a lot more in common with us. And frankly, we don't like a lot of German and Irish Americans. So we don't care if they're ticked off. No, you say, hey, we tried to stay out of this war, but now that we're in, we're going to make the world safe for democracy, and this is going to be the war to end all wars. And you engage in what's called moral diplomacy. And that's where we'll pick it up tomorrow. Okay? Can you turn that off, Ben? Thank you, sir. I think